Excellent. Welcome, everybody, to our webinar for Holocaust Remembrance Day. My name is Sue Bedry. I am the Development Officer for the Tampa Bay Times Newspaper and Education Program. And I am going to be starting a PowerPoint. I'm going to give just a small overview of our program, and then we have a featured guest tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. So again, welcome to our webinar for Holocaust Remembrance Day. This day is an international remembrance commemorating the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. Today, what we are going to do is learn just a little bit about newspaper and education. Then we're going to have a short project overview of our genocide in the 20th and 21st centuries. Then we will welcome our featured speaker, who is Tammy Bryant Spratling from Community Tampa Bay. And finally, we will open up a Q&A because we know that this presentation will spark many comments and questions. At this point, I would like to remind all attendees that we are welcoming questions through the Q&A, and you'll see this probably at the top right of your screen. And that is where you want to type your questions. You don't have to hold your questions. Go ahead and type them in as soon as you think of them. And we will be monitoring this, and that's where we will get our questions from when we get to the Q&A. So, the Tampa Bay Times Newspaper and Education Program. We are the education arm of the Tampa Bay newspaper, and we serve educators, students, and families in our circulation area by providing class sets of the Tampa Bay Times, as well as original education programs, teacher guides, lesson plans, professional development resources, and much more, all at no cost. Why this project? Why now? We are doing this project because hate crimes and crimes of bias have been increasing over the past few years. In 2021, we had almost 8,000 hate crime incidents reported to the FBI. And this covers only, it's important to know, incidents that were reported by law enforcement agencies. Not all law enforcement agencies participate in the reporting program. Of the hate crime incidents that were reported, 63% were motivated by racial, ethnic, or ancestry bias. 16% were motivated from a sexual orientation bias, and 14% were motivated by a religious bias. Similarly, the Anti-Defamation League also tracks anti-Semitic incidents, and in 2021, they actually tabulated almost 3,000 incidents. 190 of those were in Florida, by the way. So this project was initiated to examine the cultural, religious, societal, historical, economic, and political factors that lead to genocide. We wanted to do this through the lens of genocide or through the lens of survivors. Forgive me. At this point, let me pause. Jody, make sure you're recording. The goals of this project are to increase knowledge of the Holocaust and other genocides, foster understanding of the factors that lead to genocide, increase understanding of the consequences of genocide, and encourage action to address the root causes of genocide. And so the project included 4 components. The first was a newspaper and education publication. The second was a series of webinars, of which this is the last. The third component was a student art and poetry contest. And the final component is a public art exhibition and reception. So the first component was the newspaper and education publication. This was written specifically to comply with Florida law. Holocaust education is required instruction in Florida public schools. It features interviews with survivors and eyewitnesses of the Holocaust, but also the Cambodian, Bosnian, Rwandan, and Darfur genocides. It includes activities that are aligned to the Florida standards, and it is available for free download. We also have print copies are available to schools and community groups at no charge. The second component of the project was a series of webinars. We held 4 webinars between November 2022 and April 2023. And the recordings of the webinars and the presentations are also online at tampabay.com/NIE. The third component of the project was a student art and poetry contest. This was a contest for Tampa Bay area high school students. Selected work will be featured in a public exhibition at the Florida Holocaust Museum, and our grand prize winner received a $250 scholarship. The fourth and final component is an art exhibition and reception. This features the work that was selected from the submissions to our contest. It will be Wednesday, May 3rd, 2023 at the Florida Holocaust Museum. It is free and open to the public, although an RSVP is required. And it will feature guest speaker Tony Rind, who is a Holocaust survivor. We'll also be featuring our grand prize winner. And at this point, I would like to introduce our featured speaker for tonight. Tammy Bryant-Spratling is CEO of Community Tampa Bay. Community Tampa Bay is a nonprofit that envisions a community free from discrimination, in which every individual is treated with dignity and respect. Tammy has also taught civil rights law at Florida State University College of Law and Stetson Law. She speaks and writes about transformative learning theory, education law and policy, constitutional law in the modern civil rights movement, and equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Tammy also engages in pro bono work and commits herself to making Tampa Bay a better place through social justice advocacy initiatives. She is the past president of the Gasparilla International Film Festival, where her passion is bringing educational films to the Tampa Bay area that serve as tools for personal growth and transformation. And so I would like to turn our presentation over to Tammy at this time, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you so much, Sue. I really appreciate it. And thank you for that warm introduction. I'm excited to be here this evening and excited to talk about this topic. While I feel like this is a difficult topic and a heavy topic, I feel like I'm really appreciative of the space of being able to talk about this topic in this time, place, and space. So, I think we all have feelings that not only by the statistics that Sue shared, but that just the general feeling in terms of what is happening in our state and what's happening across the United States and across the world, that hate is on the rise and that discrimination is on the rise. So I think it's a really powerful opportunity to come together on Holocaust Remembrance Day to really give space to where we are and how we can take some of the lessons of the past into our current practices and into our futures. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to share a little bit about what I was thinking when you asked me to do this presentation. So you've already done such a great job to introduce me, so I won't say too much here, except that I do want to highlight our organization, which is Community Tampa Bay Incorporated. We are an anti-discrimination nonprofit, that is oriented around the concepts of social identity and understanding and learning about ourselves and about people who are different than us in the pursuit of breaking down prejudice, bias, stereotypes, and discrimination. I think it's extraordinarily powerful of a message. Community Tampa Bay has been in the Tampa Bay area since the 1940s. We were originally chapter of the National Conference for Christian and Jews. The National Conference for Christian and Jews was created as an interfaith organization to recognize the rise of hatred between Christians and Jewish people. And so the work has been long and steady over almost 100 years, and we've got a lot of work to do still. So it's been really powerful as the Chief Executive Director of Community Tampa Bay to lead this organization in this time. One of the valuable aspects of the way that we approach the work is to look at it from not just one social identity, but 10 different social identities. So everything from age, ability, faith, and class, sex, sexual orientation and gender, and race, ethnicity, and nationality. We recognize that we all have membership in different classes of those 10 different classes, but also that we are beautiful blends of multiple different membership groups. And that really makes us unique, and it uniquely impacts the way that we navigate the world. And so again, what Community Tampa Bay is about is creating spaces that are safe for individuals to come together across difference in cross-cultural interaction to have dialogue that will break down bias, prejudice, and stereotypes. So tonight's presentation felt really authentic to be able to come and complete some of the kind of the historical perspectives of this project and move into a little bit more that is timely and kind of take it into some action spaces as well. And so I think one of the beautiful connections between the work that we do and the work that the Times is doing with this project is that I firmly believe that education is the way to ensure that genocide never occurs again, right? That if we're able to learn about each other, to have meaningful intergroup dialogue and interaction, that it's a whole lot harder to hate when you know somebody, right? In fact, I was reading one of the stories that was in the publication, and I remember one of the survivors was talking about having a conversation with somebody and breaking down their hate, breaking down the intention of violence by getting to know them and by creating that humanness and that personhood in terms of connection. And so that's really what we're about, is being able to really get to a place where we are getting to know each other on a personal basis across difference. And I would really like to take just a moment to highlight and uplift one of our programs, which is our Anytown program, because really anything under that Community Tampa Bay umbrella is within that mission to be able to have cross-cultural interaction and dialogue. That Anytown program is for high school youth. And basically high schoolers from across the Tampa Bay area have been coming together over the summer since 1991 in pursuit of breaking down discrimination and building up their personal leadership skills and team building skills. Because we believe that youth are empowered to change their communities today. We just have to uplift them and listen to them. So Anytown is our ability to kind of bring these youth together, get them talking about things that really matter to them, and help them coalesce around plans to change their communities. And so we have 2 sessions this summer, and all the details about Anytown can be found on our website. So for today's discussion, I thought that we would cover 3 different topics. The first is a quick review and an exploration of bias, prejudice, and stereotypes. We know that bias, prejudice, and stereotypes unequivocally contribute to genocide. So we're going to just give a quick review of those terms and be thinking about how they impact, how they have impacted prior genocide, and also perhaps how they're impacting hateful spaces today. We'll also touch on bystanders and upstanders. We'll clarify the difference between the two and investigate how we might be able to lean into being upstanders. And then finally, we will talk about steps to take to break down hate. There's things that we all can be doing in our communities right now today to respond to hate. And so I'd like for us to just take a little bit of time there and spend some time and create some space to talk about some actions that we can be taking as a community and individually. So as we kind of think about bias, prejudice, and stereotypes, the first thing, I know sometimes these words can feel interchangeable, but they do have really distinct meanings. And I think especially when we talk about bias, sometimes it can have a negative connotation. But what I'd like to do is actually ask all of you to warmly embrace the word bias. We've heard the word implicit bias. It actually began to raise to the nation's attention when Hillary Clinton was running for president, and she was nodding to some research that was being done out of Harvard on implicit bias or implicit association. And what it did was actually it gave us the opportunity to talk about some of the prejudices and stereotypes that might exist in people that people don't really know exist there, right? They're not explicit, but they're actually implicit. They're under the surface. When I think about implicit, I also think about, for instance, a computer, right? So you have what's happening on the screen, and now those are the things that you can really see. But back behind the screen is a lot of other stuff going on. Memory and fans and all sorts of other things are going on underneath the surface. Those processes have to be there for the computer to function, but the computer's presentation is really only what's on the surface. Well, we humans are not dissimilar. We have a whole lot that's always going on in the background, and those systems can create gaps from time to time, and we can have what we call implicit bias, right? So an implicit bias, for instance, might be something that is something that you don't really like. If I said it out loud, you would say, "Oh no, I don't believe that." But somehow, somewhere along the way, you had that kind of infused into your brain in a way that might be triggered at some point and come out, even though it's unbeknownst to you. The beauty about our brains is that we have the ability to process all sorts of information at any given time, and we don't have to think conscientiously about everything, right? In fact, our brains can only hold our attention on about 7 to 11 things at a time, but our brain is also processing millions of pieces of information at the same time. So for instance, while you're listening to this webinar, you're hearing the sound of my voice, you might be looking at the camera, you might be on a different screen, scrolling through your social media. Whatever you're doing is the main focus. But at the same point, there are other things happening around you. For instance, you might have an overhead fan circulating above you. You might have a light that's flickering in the corner. There might be a leaf on a plant over in the corner that's blowing in the wind of the air conditioning. And these are things that your brain is essentially saying, these things aren't really that important. They're kind of background. I really just need to be focused on this webinar right now, right? So the brain is beautiful, but the brain is also flawed. And so that really is what the question of implicit bias gets to. And so bias can be actually favorable or it can be negative. And, it could be as simple as I was in rugby when I was in school, and I just really like other people who were in rugby in school, right? Doesn't seem terribly harmful. Prejudice, however, is oftentimes a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience, and has a negative consequence, right? So prejudice is something that can be far more harmful. And then stereotype being a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. And so one of the things that I wanted to raise up on this slide is to recognize that racial hate was what led to the Holocaust. The Nazis, in preparation for the final solution, were expounding propaganda. And in fact, actually through the Holocaust, were doing experiments on Jewish people to evaluate whether they were racially different, because the propaganda indicated that Jewish people were a inferior race. And so it was racial hatred that caused the Holocaust. And so we want to recognize that and embrace that reality here in the session. I also want to raise up what happened in Rwanda. So in Rwanda, there was ethnic in-grouping and out-grouping that caused the genocide there. And so what you have, in fact, is very interesting. It relates to colonialism. And in fact, colonizers came in and created standards that created different types of people within Rwanda. You had the Tutsis and the Hutus, and different characteristics of their faces, their skin color, the way that they presented in terms of height, etc., all were indicators whether they were characterized as a Tutsi or as a Hutu. And this categorization allowed for this in-grouping and out-grouping that then led to prejudice, stereotype, and hate. And so it's really fascinating as well, because it's really, for me, I think the Rwanda genocide really examples as well how outsiders came in and created really subjective standards to create a space of difference that then caused people to hate so much, to then commit murder and to commit mass murder. And I thought that this quote was really powerful. So this is Paul Rusesabagina. He is someone you may or may not be familiar with. He was the hotelier that was, his story was told in the movie Hotel Rwanda. And this film is probably like 15, 20 years old now, but a phenomenal film that overviews the Rwanda genocide. And I thought that this quote was extraordinarily powerful to think through how we get to the point of genocide. How does a country, how does a people, how do we get there? So I'll just give you a moment to read over this quote. What I think is the strength of this quote as well is sometimes in the time and place that we are now, people wonder where we are going as a nation, as a world. And I think it gives us the opportunity to think through, some of the messaging that we are ingesting on a regular basis and the consequences of that messaging. And so later, when we talk a little bit about the steps to breaking down hate, I think we can hold this quote in our hearts and our minds to think through, that the opportunity to respond to hate, to hateful jokes, to hateful messages, is timely and never untimely, right? Because if we are able to respond and to break it down when it's happening now, we may never see the future of something like a genocide. So I think I wanted to spend just a moment on bystanders and upstanders because I think that while these terms often come from more of like a bullying context, I think that these terms are really, really powerful in our everyday practice when we think about responding to hate and bias incidences. And I also really, really enjoyed preparing this slide and being able to outline kind of these under bystanders, the other participants, right? So I think like a bystander can also be an actor. It might not be someone who is wholly passive, right? They may be wholly passive, like a witness, but we might also have these other categories. So they kind of go in most active to least active in terms of the way that they're listed here. So a henchman is going to be that person who's really involved and active and participating alongside. An active supporter is going to be someone who's helping and doing actions that are in in uh, in sync with the actor. Passive supporters are going to be getting closer to those that are observing but not necessarily participating. Maybe they're not pulling their money or their resources or their time or their energy out of the system or out of the space that these incidents are happening. And then, of course, we have our disengaged onlookers and our witnesses. And I think when we envision these different characteristics of people, we can think about, when we see bias incidents happening in the news and we see sometimes people who are not involved, but they might have a video camera that's standing there. And so sometimes we question, we're like, why wouldn't they have stepped in? Why didn't they take a more active role? And really, when I think what we're really asking of them is for them to become upstanders. And so an upstander is going to be someone who does something to prevent or to reduce the injustice, that is going to be taking some type of active intermediary or interceptive step in approaching the situation when they see it. And it takes a lot of evaluation. It's not something that can be done easily. And in fact, it really should be something that can be trained. And there are some phenomenal community resources to help train people in how to become upstanders, not only just through trainings that might be more focused on bullying, but actually bias incidents and more severe hate crime response. And so, if you're interested in that, I'd love for you to reach out to me and I can point you to some resources of different spaces that you might be able to be trained in becoming an upstander and being able to lean in to acting against an injustice. I'll also say, though, that it is not always safe to act against an injustice, and we have to make those determinations live time. No one can make those decisions for you. They have to be a space that you are evaluating what is happening, whether you're safe, whether your family's safe. There's so much that goes into being an upstander. And that's what I appreciate about trainings as well, is because they go into some of that and allow for you to think of those things a little bit beforehand. I love from time to time to tell a bit of a personal story, and this one's one of the most vulnerable I think that I have, which is um, a instance of upstander and someone who was very inspired by. So my husband and I are an interracial couple, and my parents are white, and I'm adopted, and my a few years back, long before we were actually, well, even before we were married, we went to a wedding, and this was a wedding of a family member on kind of an extended family side. And my husband and I were there, and we were out on the dance floor dancing and laughing. And someone came up to my sister and said, "I see that your sister brought an escort." And my sister is a little bit Pollyanna. She didn't quite understand what that meant. She struggled with the question for a minute, and she knew something didn't sound right about it, but she just kind of went with it. kind of confused where he was going. And then he made it easier for her because he responded back and said, I don't know about you, but I just hate to see that. And so my sister actually went to my father and told my father about it. And this gentleman was somebody that my dad had known for a long, long, long time, and in fact was family by marriage. And in that moment, my dad decided that he was going to kick this person out of the wedding and disinvite him from his house forevermore. And I distinctly remember telling my dad in that moment, like, my husband and I have signed up for this. We're in love, and there's nothing that's going to stop that. And this is our fight and our battle. And you don't need to make it yours. And I think it gave my dad the opportunity to think through that. And he continued to choose to be an upstander. And he came to our aid in that way. And he made personal decisions about his interaction with that man again in the future. So I think, there's always things to weigh. We have to make decisions that potentially could harm us, harm our relationships with other people. But I think, you make that decision for yourself in those circumstances, and you can't, frankly, I feel like you can't make a wrong decision in that way. I always appreciate Elie Wiesel's quote here: to remain silent and indifferent is the greatest sin of all. And I placed it right after the upstander bystander slide because I think it really just reiterates to me that to be a bystander potentially could be in line with this quote, and that we have the opportunity to use our voices and to speak out and against. When I feel like there's so many different discriminatory initiatives happening right now, there's no shortage in who you might choose to speak out for. But I think it's an opportunity in this space and this time to think very holistically about hate and about discrimination and how we can advocate for people who potentially are being targeted, who are different than us. Maybe we don't belong to that group specifically, but we can see their humanness and we can see their need for advocacy. So I just always enjoyed that quote. In fact, when I graduated from law school, I had the opportunity to give a keynote address, and I was able to use that quote. It's been something that's been with me for a long, long time. So where we are now is I'd just like to breeze through some of these actions that we can take to break down hate. And I think some of them are intuitive, but I think some of them are also an opportunity for further discussion. So as we are going through these, if you have any follow-up questions or any thoughts, please feel free to drop them into the chat. But I want to kind of just go through each of them individually and just think a little bit about different ways that we can respond to hate. So I'd like to say first and foremost that I've brought these over from the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center is the preeminent trackers of hate groups in the United States. So they have, in fact, a map that is focused on all the different hate groups across the United States. You can go on their website and take a look. And I think you can even tap in a zip code, or at least you can zero into an area on a map, and you can see what type of hate groups exist within your community or from your hometown or wherever you are interested. But it is fascinating to have that visual image of all the different hate groups. It also gives you the opportunity to read about them and what are their tenets, what are they fighting for, how are they fighting against people, how are they inhumanizing people. So there's a lot of really, really rich information on that map. And so these are their 10 suggested ways of breaking down hate that I thought were super powerful to be thinking about things that we can be doing individually and as a community. So the first is ACT, and this one's probably the most simple, but I think, the reason why it's first is because doing something is better than doing nothing. And I think just taking the first step and speaking out against hate, taking an action like the ones that we're going to talk about further down the list, all of these different things, if you're able to do something, if each one of us does something, then we're able to make a mark. And so I would like, just for you to take a moment in your own time and allow for yourself to think about this question. Think about if a hate group were coming to your town, what would you want to do? What actions could you potentially take? How would you like to respond to a hate group coming to your town? Just give that a thought for a moment or two. There's no right answer. It was just a moment for you to be able to reflect. Some of the other things that you can do to act is to counter hate with goodness. I think that this is a strategy not only in our individual capacities, but in ways that we can respond to the media. Oftentimes, media can be focused on the negative, but we also can uplift stories of hope and stories of love and unity and connectedness. And there's so many beautiful stories in our communities, so we can create the space for those stories to be uplifted, and we can tell those stories on our own social media and in our own spaces. Um, we can also talk to friends about biased incidences. So I recall some of my friends came to me. I didn't live in this community, but several of my friends came to me about flyers, anti-Semitic flyers that were dropped in their mailboxes, and how offensive that was to them and how angry they were. And so I think expressing that out and telling those stories is really important, because if we don't talk about them, then we are ingesting them without there being any outrage, which gets to be pretty close to Elie Wiesel's quote. So I think we have to make sure that we are creating that space to talk about these incidences and to make sure that we are telling people that these things are happening in our communities. We also sometimes get this sense of like, it doesn't happen in my town or it doesn't happen in my community. But I think if we uplift these stories, we'll be able to show that, in fact, it really does sometimes hit our own communities. In fact, I remember just a few weeks ago, I was out near the river and there was a swastika on one of the bridges here in Tampa. And I think about, so there's the opportunity, I think, for me to have maybe reported that, or maybe to have gone out and tried to wash it down myself. And actually, for weeks, I've been thinking about how I should have leaned into that as an opportunity. So I know next time that I see that vandalism, I'm going to make sure that I do take some type of action. Our second one is join forces, and I think community coalitions are extraordinarily powerful. I think even if we can create community coalitions that are intergroup, those are even more powerful to break down hate, right? Because it's not then just one group, but multiple groups coming together to fight against hate. So creating community coalitions can be extraordinarily powerful and give us the opportunity to see hate from multiple lenses as well, and to share stories of hate that has occurred against us with one another. The third is supporting victims. And I think through the concept of supporting victims, not only as the supporting, supporting those that have experienced hate in our communities, but also those in our communities who have come here to seek refuge from hate. We have a beautiful array of refugees here in the Tampa Bay area, and we have many refugee groups that are supporting and providing support services and resources to refugees who are coming to our area. And so there's some really great opportunity to volunteer with a refugee group and to learn and hear from them about their story and how they came here and how they are seeking a refuge from hate. Speaking up is sometimes one of the easiest and the hardest things to do. Sometimes using our voice against hate can be challenging. It can feel sometimes unpopular or alienating, but we have the opportunity to speak up and out against hate at any given time. And so that might be as simple as, again, talking to family and friends, or at your church or in your community groups, really, anywhere, writing a letter to public officials, or writing a petition. There's all sorts of different ways that you can speak up about hate. And then creating space to educate yourself. I think education is obviously always my favorite tool to break down hate. I think, as you heard during my bio, I love the idea of utilizing film specifically for learning about different groups and learning about different historical events. Some of the most powerful films that I have seen have been addressing genocide or addressing violence in different countries. And even if they're not 100% accurate, they still give me the opportunity to go back and do my own research and evaluate for myself the history and be able to understand, understand the significance of those events and to understand the lives of those people. That's just been something, I don't know why, it's been something that has been super powerful for me throughout my life. I remember leaning into these films even when I was in high school. And when I think about the current conversations about what K through 12 students can digest about our history, I think it's so important for us to be thinking through what is important for youth to know these days, and how can we make sure that they are learning inclusive history that is about the Holocaust, history that is about Rwandan genocide, history that is about Darfur, all of the different genocides that have occurred, all the different groups that have been persecuted across history. So incredibly important for us to have the opportunity to create space for our youth to be learning this history. And I see that Sue has dropped the most recent genocide in the 20th and 21st century publication in the chat. And I do encourage you to read it. It's a phenomenal read. I've been combing over it for the last couple of days and learning so much anew. So thank you for creating that publication. I also think education comes from people and intergroup connection and intergroup connectedness. I think about how when we have meaningful connection with people who are different than us, we are able to learn more about the way that they navigate the world, their values, their approach to their families and to their friends and to their work. And it's just incredibly rich content to understand that we all have things that make us uniquely beautiful, but also so much in common. Particularly, we find that many of our values are quite similarly aligned. So having education certainly is for books and for movies and for that type of content where you might be doing a lot of that learning individually, but also leaning into educational spaces that are diverse, that are with other people, and learning across difference. Creating an alternative, I thought this one was interesting. They just talked about how we don't want to support hate rallies and I think sometimes maybe curiosity could bring people down to a hate rally or some level of interest, but there's the opportunity, I think, when hate comes to town to create spaces of unity and spaces of positive response as well. I think something that I read in terms of preparation for this as well was like that, hate is protected by the Constitution, but so is love, so is hope, so is unity. And so I think creating spaces where we are fighting hate through unity, I think when it comes to town is extraordinarily meaningful and powerful to show. Sometimes I feel like what's happening is the loudest voice in the room is getting the attention right now, but we all have the opportunity to be the loudest voice, and collectively, those that stand for peace and for love and for inclusion are greater in numbers than those that stand for hate. And so we can remember that, and we can organize around that and stand against hate in that way. Pressure leaders, I think, is pretty obvious. I think is just the idea of getting in front of public officials and making sure, and public and leaders, making sure that they know how you feel about these incidents, to make sure that it's not something that becomes commonplace in our communities, that every single time that there's a hate-based incident or a bias incident, that it is being raised to their attention as something that we don't want in our communities, that we want to make sure that these incidents are raised up, that are erased, that are not welcome in our communities. And so making sure that leaders know to keep the pressure on, to keep responding to bias incidences. I think sometimes, a bias incident can happen and there may not be anyone that's held accountable for it. Either they cannot be located, or what they did does not rise to the level of a crime. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't respond, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be outraged. So expressing our outrage and continuing to have that conversation and continuing to put pressure on our leaders is extraordinarily important. I also want to raise attention during the pressure leaders point is that sometimes we also hold the people that are building up spaces of inclusion accountable, because not all the time do they have the right language, right? So in spaces of diversity, equity, and inclusion, language frequently changes. And I actually recall several years ago, we had a group of youth who were speaking with people in Tallahassee, and there was an anti-discrimination proposal brought by a person who we much appreciated, and by and large has very inclusive views. However, the piece of legislation did not include inclusive language. So sometimes we actually have to hold accountable the leaders who are pushing forward anti-discrimination initiatives as well, and make sure that they are truly inclusive and that they don't have blind spots in terms of the way that they are crafting that legislation. I couldn't have been more proud of our youth as they very appropriately and professionally navigated calling out that leader and changing that language. And I'm proud to say that because of their advocacy, that language did get changed in the proposal. And then we have teach acceptance. So this is not just educating ourselves, but educating those that are around us, especially our little ones. We have the opportunity to share lessons of our history, to share lessons of people who are different than us, to introduce groups that are different than us, to introduce thought that is different than ours. And so teaching acceptance at a young age is always age appropriate. There are ways that we can discuss difficult topics with little ones and make sure that they are safe and protected, and then introducing the tougher and tougher topics as they get older. But it's never it's never too young to start somebody on acceptance and the opportunities to connect with people who are different than them. And then finally, digging deeper. And this is like there's a lot of different ways that you can dig deeper. You can dig deeper by evaluating your own spaces of bias and prejudices and stereotypes and assumptions. The implicit bias test that I talked about, the Harvard Implicit Association Test, is a fantastic tool to be able to evaluate your own spaces of bias and whether those are present in your mind. In fact, I've taken several of those over the course of the years, and one of them that I did was about women leaders. And in fact, during that assessment, I learned that I had a bias toward women leaders, which I thought was really fascinating. But it's given me the opportunity to kind of evaluate, where does that come from? Why would I feel that way? And how can I navigate the future when I'm working with a male leader versus a female leader? So it's really fascinating to be able to kind of get that insight and think through how your own potential biases can be impacting the way that you navigate the world. And so you have the opportunity as well to and dig deeper, to do that learning, to evaluate your intergroup contact. How many times do you go to a place where you are the only person that looks like you, or how many times are you the only person that shares the faith that you do in a space? To just evaluate, kind of keep track of your intergroup connections and those different spaces that potentially could lead to how you navigate the world. So I wanted to leave us here with this quote, which comes from Carl Wilkins. He's a humanitarian that was in Rwanda before the genocide began. This is him and his family in Rwanda. And then once the genocide began, he did have to send his family out of Rwanda, and he stayed back to help support. So he said, imagine if all through our school life we had the habit and opportunity not only solving problems, but of respect, empathy, and inclusion, understanding that there's models called power over and models called power with. And unfortunately, much of our education and the rest of the world is power over, as opposed to the growth that comes, the unlimited resources available when we go with the mentality of power with. And I just think that this is the kind of the getting back to the Community Tampa Bay mission, which is to create spaces of cross-cultural interaction and dialogue. We live in this space of creating respect, empathy, and inclusion, and creating spaces for meaningful intergroup dialogue. It is a bit of the long-range plan, and sometimes, especially in times like now, it can feel slow, especially when it feels like we have to respond to things in more of a crisis response. But this is the necessary work to ensure that we don't get ourselves anywhere close to a genocide. So I just really appreciated this quote, and I thought it was really powerful coming from somebody who lived through genocide. So with that, that's what I have prepared for this evening. But if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer those at this time, as well as hear from Sue or Jody. I'm just glad to be here. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Tammy. Did you stop sharing your?
I did.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jody Pushkin. I'm the manager of the Tampa Bay Times newspaper and education program. And I just want to let you know that to type in your questions, you need to click on the Q&A, not the chat. So if you click on the Q&A, you can go ahead and ask your questions there. And I'm going to actually start off with a question for Tammy. I'm curious, in the conversation that you talked about the differences between bias and prejudice, do you think that bias leads to prejudice, Or do you think that they have those they're two separate ideals?
I think that's a great question. I do think that bias can inform prejudice, but really bias is kind of more of a mental process where prejudice is more of a kind of like a conscientious um, belief held without a basis. So I do think that bias can inform prejudice, but I would say that prejudice is really that second space of really taking something that we've believed and rooting ourselves down into it.
Thank you.
So I was so grateful that you had dropped in the publication. I think that there's so much rich information, and I'm hopeful that all of the attendees will give it a read.
So can you hear me, Tammy?
I can.
So this is Sue. I actually wanted to, I think one of the situations that occurs really commonly for a lot of people, and many of us don't really know how to handle it, is either in person or maybe on social media, someone in your immediate circle, somewhat like the story that you shared with us, says something that that is really bigoted or hateful, and many of us in the moment we we don't know how to respond to that. Where would be some resources where people could go to kind of get some of those placeholder phrases that you can say while you're kind of trying to think of a way to engage, and not argue, but just engage or disengage, but something to say in the meantime? Can you think of any websites or anything that would be a good place for people to go and look?
Yeah, so absolutely. I do really appreciate the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance project. I think that they have so many tips and tricks in terms of responding. I also think that there's actually an entire blog that is about microaggressions. I'm not kidding. It is literally, if you go on this website, I think it might even just be microaggressions.org or .com or something along those lines. It is all just a list of different microaggressions that people have heard. And I think what I appreciate about that website is that you learn so much about what people say, but you also importantly learn what potentially you could be saying, that maybe you never thought could be a microaggression. And so I think both of those websites are websites that I really find valuable. I've gone to both of them to kind of explore a little bit in terms of what there could be. I also think a really great strategy is to ask for clarification, and or I think also the that's interesting. Tell me more about that. I think sometimes what happens is that someone will say something and might not think through it completely and realize the harmful effect. And so I think the opportunity to have them repeat it is oftentimes for them to also have the opportunity to clarify it or correct it. And so I've used that tactic quite a bit to really call it to their attention to what they really said. And I've also used that as an opportunity for me to kind of de-escalate myself and to take a moment so that I can have a more thoughtful response and a more thoughtful conversation, as opposed to that first time I hear it, it's such a loud kind of alarm for me that I need a moment to kind of take a deep breath and say, okay, I'm gonna just sit back in this for a second and give them another opportunity to explain. I've found that people can say something pretty offensive one time, it's hard for them to say it twice in a row.
Excellent. And I dropped the link. Teaching Tolerance is now called Learning for Justice. And I dropped a link in the chat. And then we have a comment from an attendee who feels what I think many people do, a little frustrated that our elected officials or our leaders don't listen to us, that we do speak up and that nothing changes. So I mean, I would go back to your slide and say, dig deeper, keep doing it. But I don't know if Jody or Tammy, either of you want to comment on that.
Well, I have a lot to say about that, and I'm sure I'm certainly in shared space. I think that comment is from Daniel, so thank you, Daniel, for that. I couldn't agree more with the frustration. It is a daily existence in running a nonprofit that is focused on anti-discrimination work. What I will say though is the lesson that I've learned. Let's see if it's helpful for you. So I talked to Jody and Sue about this in our preparations, but a couple of weeks ago, I felt like I was really starting to kind of spin and trying to think through as I'm seeing all these different kind of hate-filled proposed pieces of legislation, certainly discriminatory legislation, and that we're not looking at just one, and I'm using air quotes purposefully, right? Just one identity, but we're really looking at hate coming at us in many different angles, and that can feel very overwhelming. And I think, where I was a few weeks ago was this feeling of overwhelmingness, and where do you even begin when there's so many places to begin? And I really began to start kind of thinking through this as what I was calling like a spreading wildfire, right? And we were really experiencing kind of a spreading wildfire of hate. And what I realized is my response was becoming a little bit like a one person with a bucket kind of, response to a wildfire, right? Running over here as I see this spark, over here hit. And then another tree goes up in flames over here, and I run with my little bucket and I try to get that one. And then over here, there's another tree and I want to get in there. And then I want to, cut this fire off over here at the pass. And so I'm just kind of running back and forth, and I'm trying to put out all of these fires from different angles. And that can feel very frustrating, and that can feel really big. And what I realized is, when it comes to the work that we do, we're actually we're not the firefighters. We're the folks that come in and we clear the brush once the fire's gone. We prep the earth for planting. We sprinkle the seeds, and we water, and we cultivate. Right? That's education. And that was a huge moment for me as a leader, as a person who believes that we can live in a community free from all forms of discrimination and hate. And it was intense, but it helped me to really be driven down back in the fact that we all play our role to fight against this, and that maybe our leaders aren't listening. But we have the opportunity from wherever we sit in the community to do something. And so, I hope that's helpful, at least to just even feel heard and seen about like that frustration, because the frustration is really real, and it's a pandemic, right? Like, you are not the only person that feels that way, that it's a common feeling. And so I hope that we can all, with our buckets, right? If we all take our buckets and we keep on focusing, hopefully we can start to make an impact, because I really do believe that there are more of us that believe in unity and inclusion than believe in hate. I think, Sue, you're on mute there.
I am. Sorry about that. Let's give Tammy a break for just a second, Jody, and I want to circle back. For those of you who don't know, Jody was the person who wrote the publication, the newspaper and education publication, and she had the privilege of personally interviewing survivors and witnesses, eyewitnesses to genocides. So I wonder, Jody, if you could talk a little bit about that, about what struck you from having talked to people who lived through these events, and maybe some of the commonalities or the differences between their stories and their experiences.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot, Sue. I think that the thing that surprised me the most was the commonalities. You would think that there was nothing in common with somebody who suffered through the Holocaust with somebody who was in Rwanda, and yet their stories are very similar. Each survivor, each genocide survivor has a unique story and a unique perspective, but there are those underlying things that are often similar, especially when you look at things that are going on in the news right now. There are a lot of parallels between intolerance and prejudice and stereotypes. Those kind of things seem to have been the lead-in for most of the people that I spoke to, the interviews were very powerful. I appreciate the comments about the publication, but the stuff, there was only so much room to put all the information in there, and there was just so much rich material that I received in talking to the people.
It really recalls the first quote, Tammy, that you had put up, that nothing happened all at once. It didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process that led. There's another question in the chat that I don't know the answer to. I don't know, Tammy, if you can respond to it.
Sure. So that question, is there any strong data collected more recently to show that those living in Florida are more vulnerable to prejudices of one of the the 10 social identities than elsewhere in the United States, especially in northern states? I think that that's a really interesting question. And so, Cindy, what I would say there is that it's it's challenging for us to get data in two ways. So one, hate-based incidences being tracked are being underreported and under-tracked, right? So so we know that we have some statistics. Sue did a great job to encapsulate what we do have in terms of data, but any reported data we know is actually far more underrepresented because groups that are marginalized and groups that are victimized are less likely to come forward. So that's one struggle in getting sound data. The other piece is that when we look at the 10 different social identities that Community Tampa Bay focuses on, not all of those are going to directly apply to a protected class. And then the other piece is that a lot of the data that we get actually comes from groups that respond to a specific group's hate, right? So we have like the NAACP, who's going to be tracking incidences there. We have CARE Florida that's going to be tracking incidences there, Equality Florida that's tracking incidences there. So we don't have really a place where all of that data is coming into one place and looking at all hate-based incidences as a whole, if that makes sense.
Just to chime in on the underreporting too. So you have the issue of people who are experiencing incidents of hate or bias, not being comfortable reporting them, and then you also have the issue of those incidences then being reported to whatever central clearinghouse does exist. The FBI does have the Uniform Crime Reporting Clearinghouse, but they say on the very front page they have there are more than 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and just over 11,000 reported hate crimes to the FBI last year. So they know that there is a large chunk of data that's just not there, that's just not being reported. So, what we know is indicative, but it's by no means the whole story. Jody, I'm going to kick it over to you for some of the questions that you had. You're muted.
Of course I am. I wanted to go back to what Tammy said about microaggressions. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what a microaggression is and how maybe people can deal with that, especially in everyday situations like the situation you ran into, or in a workplace situation?
Absolutely, absolutely. So a microaggression is a everyday slight, insult, put down, invalidation, or offensive behavior that people experience daily, even potentially from a well-intentioned individual, and that they may be unaware of the person, the offender may be unaware of, but that feels demeaning and invalidating. And microaggressions can have a tremendous impact on people because they kind of wear down. And oftentimes they can be housed in prejudice and stereotype, and can really have an impact, a quiet impact on people in the workplace. And so when we train around microaggression, we like to raise up different common microaggressions to allow for people to know and to think about them, and to realize that they can be harmful, and to just ensure that people are thinking through the language that they use, because even sometimes it can feel like a compliment, but because it's rooted in a stereotype, it will not feel like a compliment to that person, right? And is not a compliment. So yeah, so those microaggressions are common. We all are capable of also stating microaggressions. I don't know if you've ever walked yourself into one. I know certainly I am human enough to admit that I have. And it's I think it's more important what you do if you have made them, than necessarily being able to read every single one on the microaggression blog and make sure that you never ever state one, right? Just kind of being mindful of how you respond. And the number one response is to apologize for the harm, right? And to recognize that even though we may not have intended to be harmful, our actions could be harmful.
And I'm not sure that you can answer this question. It's a little tricky, but I was wondering, we tend to be in our society, we tend to combat hate with hate. How does one express outrage or anger without falling into that trap?
That's such a good question, and it is a tricky one. I think that it's so fascinating because this is something I've thought about for years. Because I do think that there are different approaches to social change. There are different philosophies around social change, and I think at the end of the day, I think that there is the fact that each person has to make their own decision how they want to approach hate. I think about the incredible lessons that we can draw from Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King, and others that approached social change during the 60s, right? Oftentimes, history likes to remember that the modern civil rights movement was a nonviolent movement. But that is not 100% accurate, that there were incidences of violence, there were incidences of uprisings and riots during the civil rights movement as well. And so nonviolence is one tactic and philosophy of social change. There are others, right? But I think, like, for me, I think the fighting hate with hate just leads to another opportunity for people to hate, right? So I think about, if we were to have two groups that hate each other fight it out, maybe at the end of that fight, only one group would exist. But I can promise you that in that group would then divide, and there would be a hate and a hate group, and they would fight again, right? And I just feel like you have to break the hate. And I think one of the beautiful lessons that I have learned through learning about the civil rights movement is those moments where humanity and peace de-escalated violence, and in that there being so much power in terms of social progress as opposed to violence. And so, I think, I don't know if that's terribly relevant to your question, but I think, for me, it's really, it's such an interesting, challenging question, but at the same point is a very personally clear one for me, because I've thought about it for years and years and years, and I've had so much exposure to different tactics to social change that I've settled on the one that works for me.
And I appreciate that. Those are great. That was a great answer. I was actually thinking of a conversation I had with somebody earlier today who was talking about how she leaves work and she's in a good mood, and then she gets in traffic, and then all of a sudden she has road rage. And I was thinking, you're combating rage with rage.
Yes.
You're combating what the other people are doing by you becoming more aggressive as well, and that's not solving anybody's problem.
That's right. Yeah, it's just escalating the situation. And I think, we've probably almost all been there, right? To feel a feeling of frustration with another driver, and it doesn't make anyone feel better, right? Like, at the end of the day, it doesn't resolve the issue. It doesn't keep them from cutting you off. It doesn't keep them from having done what they did to you to originally make you upset. So it's not a fulfilling construct. So I think that, that's that's a practical application as well, for sure.
And also, just to give a little plug to Carl Wilkins, you mentioned him earlier, which you posted that great quote from him. I had the honor of getting to speak with him, which was amazing. He has a website called The World Outside My Shoes. If anybody is interested, it's a really good website, and it tells a little bit more about his story. The uniqueness that he was in a situation where he was told to leave and didn't, and stood up and wound up working with the enemy to help his friends, is very compelling.
And I read a lot about him as well, and I really appreciated how he talks about, I think it's in the publication, in fact, how he talks about how it was a struggle for him as well to be interacting and needing help from some people, and then knew that they could be turning right around and murdering people, right? And so how humans have so much complication in who we are. We like to think through humans as being either good or bad, right? Or we like these binary constructs when it comes to humans. And the fact of the matter is, we are all so much further complicated than that. So I really appreciated how he he talked about that, and he talked about his own personal struggle of meeting with these people, relying on these people, you know, and needing favors even, and how complicated that could be. I just felt like that was really powerful. And so thank you for sharing that part of his story.
It's hard to know when you're trying to be an upstander. It's hard to know sometimes who to trust.
Yes.
And he was unfortunately was put into that situation. I have one more question for you. You talked about Camp Anytown, but I'd also like to know what other kind of trainings you guys do at Community Tampa Bay.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. It's my favorite topic. So we do kind of two other main types of programming. One is community conversations, and we will do a community conversation on any topic that needs to be discussed by the community. So we've had an entire recent series called Huddle for Change, which was about race equity, and a topic. So we covered the wealth gap, physical health, mental health, criminal justice, and education. We've also partnered with the Tampa Bay Times Newspapers and Education on our Pathways for Understanding series, which raised attention to Islamophobia. And we utilized a workshop type of process where we could have community conversations and engage folks in learning about Islamophobia and breaking down Islamophobia. And then we will also do our workplace trainings where we will go into a workplace or a community organization, really any kind of group of learners who are interested in doing what we would say is a little bit more traditional diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging training. And the topics really are driven by what the needs of the organization are and how they would like to have conversations. Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff. It gives us the opportunity to really build up community within those workplaces.
Thank you. And now I'm going to put Sue on the spot. Sue, I have a question for you. You brought up the examples of what somebody should do and how they should respond when a hate group comes to town. You put those in the Q&A, and I'd like to draw attention to that. Some of these are things that you can do. It won't take you very long, and some of them are a little bit more intensive. Did you have a preference on these, or were they just a list of good ideas that you came up with?
They were just ideas that occurred to me when I was listening to Tammy, because I think a lot of people are thinking, oh, I need to get out there with a sign and counter protest. But ooh, that's not me. I don't go to protests. If I get seen my work, I might get in trouble with work. That's not something that I'm comfortable doing. Well, there are a lot of things that you can do besides going out and protesting. I mean, that's great, to be out there in public. But for example, you can contact your elected officials. It's very easy. You can go online and type in your address, and it'll tell you who your elected officials are and link to their website. And they have a comment form right on the website that you can type in. You can similarly write a letter to the editor of your hometown newspaper. If you are in the Tampa Bay area, of course, that would be the Tampa Bay Times. And I know that for our newspaper, again, you can do that online very easily. And I think that that's probably the case with almost every newspaper out there. There are other examples of things that people can do. You can, of course, as Tammy mentioned, you can join an organization that fits with your values. And if you don't have time to go to meetings, you can help them out with a donation. That can be, of course, a monetary donation. You can write a check. If you don't have the ability to give a charitable donation of money, Many of these groups are in need of other types of help. They might need an in-kind donation for their office, of supplies, of office supplies or cleaning supplies. They might need time. So example, if you have skills that would be useful to a group, if you know how to design a website, or you are a graphic designer, for example, or you know how to write, there are often behind the scenes roles that groups really need help with, that you can do without necessarily, being there. And as Tammy mentioned, uplifting stories of hope and kindness, and inclusion is probably the easiest thing you can do. By sharing those stories on your social media, by talking about them with your friends and family, that is something that is not confrontational and yet makes a difference. It makes a difference every day. I know when I open my social media, sometimes my news feed is all full of disturbing stories, and then I will come across the friend who is talking about their kid who is volunteering with a youth group, and they went out and painted someone's house. It lifts my day, and it does that for other people. And so I think that's probably the easiest and maybe one of the most important things that people can do.
Thank you. Those are all great ideas. Tammy, did you have anything to add?
No, I would just encourage everyone to keep learning and keep speaking and just keep acting. keep your bucket ready.
And filled with water.
Exactly.
All right. Well, Jody, if you'll send me live, I'll put up the last screen that has our contact information. So I am just going to go back to my PowerPoints and say thank you very, very much to our presenters. Thank you, Tammy from Community Tampa Bay, and Jody from Newspaper and Education. Many of you may have questions that you didn't think of during the presentation. So here's how you can contact us. You can contact Newspaper and Education if you would like print copies of the publication for your classroom or for your community group. Order nie@tampabay.com is the email that will get to us. If you want to download copies of the publication, of the teacher's guide, or explore any of the other resources that we have on our site, tampabay.com/nie will get you there. If you are interested in learning more about Community Tampa Bay's many resources that they offer our community, communitytampabay.org is the website to visit. And if you are interested, if you know a young person who might benefit from Anytown, there is a section on the website that talks about Anytown, gives some testimonials from youth who have gone through the program, and I do believe that the application is right online. And then Tammy, you shared your email earlier in your presentation, so I put it up in here. If you have questions for Tammy, feel free to drop her a note. And then finally, we would like to know what you think of this webinar. There is a SurveyMonkey survey. It's very short, but it will help us make our webinars better. So you'll see the link on your screen. It's surveymonkey.com/r/SW5Y6GS. And we will also send you an email following up from this webinar that includes that link. That might be a little easier. So again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy evening to join us here tonight. We really, really appreciate it. And I hope that you go out and spread some love and kindness and anti-hate in your community, as we will all endeavor to do.
And I also put the link in the Q&A box.
All right, well, if there's nothing else, thank you again so much, and we're going to go ahead and end our presentation for this Monday evening. I would encourage you all to visit the two websites, and also to consider coming to our event on May 3rd, which is the public exhibition and reception, where you'll be able to see the art that was inspired by the publication, by this topic, and listen to a Holocaust survivor speak about her experiences. So again, thank you and have a good night.